All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to we're going to call this a community conversation. So last month we had our first critical conversation between Yehuda and Walid, and it was, by all accounts, a really thoughtful and stimulating conversation. And the two of them just had a wonderful back and forth, and we really had an opportunity to get into some of the issues in the conflict. Of course, there's a lot deeper that we can go and that the two of them can go. And as most of you have heard, over the last 24 hours, Walid experienced a tremendous loss in his family circle, and a good friend of his daughter was killed in Gaza. And so he requested to postpone the next critical conversation with Yehuda, which we've honored that request, but we wanted to proceed with a conversation today that really honors his participation and his critical role in this ongoing dialogue. But also, I think there's an opportunity to carry forward the torch that was lit in March and to continue the conversation here. So with that, we'll begin. I'll say a few opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to our facilitator, Bill Phillips, and we'll go from there. So in our conversation last month with Walid and Yehuda, the two of them spoke really quite expansively about what comes next and the opportunity to reimagine. Certainly Yehuda spoke about reimagining what the Jewish project might look like. And for Walid, also the importance of dialogue and conversation, not to perpetuate the situation, but really to deepen the relationships such that a real future can be created that works for all people. And one of the points that I think is important to bring out today is the conversation that's going around that it's not okay to talk with people who have opposing viewpoints. And we hear this in multiple circles of this conflict. And people have built really these intellectual edifices to justify the situation in their favor and demonize, quote unquote, the other. And that really doesn't work because we're all human beings. We're all part of one big family, certainly the Abrahamic family, which has become a bit dysfunctional, but is still a family, and the opportunity for reconciliation is still there. And if you look at our history and our traditions, we have a common patriarch, Ibrahim or Abraham. And Abraham was tapped by the divine intelligence to spread a message of a higher power and a higher purpose in the world. And the path of Jews and Muslims diverged with Isaac and Ishmael into two tribes and two religions. But in the Torah, if you look at the Torah, the prophet Isaiah foretold of a time when the lion would lay down with the lamb and peace would come across the earth. And the Quran says that God created tribes and nations so that people could get to know each other. And I think it's by living rightly and heeding the will of God and being kind to one another. It's really not that complicated. We can become better people and serve our families and create a future that's worthy of who we would like to be. And our traditions teach that we should accept peace when it's offered to us. And of course, it's the rare person who hasn't demonized, again, the quote unquote other at some point in time. But we have an opportunity to reconcile. And I think this kind of conversation is much needed in the world today and can provide an opening for a path forward. And I think we get to test the limits, really, of how far we can go to create peace through these conversations when we have a willingness to accomplish a breakthrough in what's been really a seemingly intractable conflict. And of course, there are very difficult issues. There's the anger, the stridency, the arrogance, even the moral indignation, the surety. But there is one thing we can agree on, which is that we're at times repulsed by each other's strategies and words and behavior. But there's something else we can agree on too, I think, which is the sheer scale of the human tragedy and the barbarity and just the terribleness of death and the long road of trauma. So I think today is an opportunity for all of us to come here together and say enough is enough. As we just said, for some of us at the Passover Seder, Dayenu, enough, it would have been enough. So we're joined today by really a wonderful cast of people, including my good friend Esam Boraey, who's from Egypt, and Daniel Weiner from the University of Connecticut, and Majid Alsayegh, who's an old friend and longtime participant and believer in the value of interfaith dialogue, and Samir Musa, who's one of our musician partners, and as I defined for him last night, a mensch, an all-around good guy. And our facilitator today is Bill Phillips, who is a master of human transformation and a demonstration of neutrality. So we're very fortunate to have Bill with us in the role of facilitator. And with that, Bill, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Let's begin straight away, really. What I intend today is that we listen to one another, and to do that, we'll have one person talking at a time, if that's okay. So if you feel that you need to interrupt or you've got something to say that's really urgent, then please raise your hand on the app, and we'll come to you as soon as we can. Is that okay with everyone? Good. Okay. Well, look, where should we start?
Oh, Bill, if you could just acknowledge ladies and gentlemen today as well.
If there are ladies here, I haven't seen any, so that's why.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have Amy and Jess and Yasmin and two Elizabeths.
Please let me sound very sorry about that. I didn't know. So yes, of course, welcome. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, well, maybe we can start with Samir. Samir, you spoke so eloquently last night about the power of the last critical conversation. And why don't we begin by acknowledging Walid and the love we have for him and his role and just the courage it takes to participate in this kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I want to also acknowledge Yehuda, because as I'm sure that he's also on the front lines of extensive loss that shake his foundation. And I think it's to that point that that we meet, because we're seeing it now on the face of Walid, who, as we know, lost someone, or close, 2 degrees separation recently. And it's just that I think it opens up an opportunity for us to recognize what it takes to be on the ground in those environments and to address, I guess, another face of the conflict, which could begin with how do we support someone who needs to mourn, so that processes can complete themselves in order for the next level of healing to be able to reach them, right? The trauma is so real and extensive that I think anything we can do to help support the healing through the process would be a good place to start. And I want to thank everyone again. I thanked them earlier, but for being here and putting energy towards this bridge building activity that we are partaking in. So I thank you all for that.
Thank you, Samir. And Yehuda has entered the room. Welcome, Yehuda. Samir, can you recreate for Yehuda what you were just saying about him?
Well, yes, I want to begin by thanking you, Yehuda. How are you? I'm Samir. I watched the first critical conversation between you and Walid, and having been, an Arab American with a family in that part of the world, and just well aware of the conditions for the entirety of my life. I was, and having been there, I was very grateful to you both to be able to come to the table with a willingness to prioritize an effort of reconciliation before any self-interested motivation. You held it very well. Both of you did. I was very inspired by your ability to rise above and reach the higher goal. And so I'm grateful to you and Walid for being there and coming up. You know, we are addressing that Walid has experienced a loss close to him, and that it reflects the face of this conflict that is kind of doesn't know a boundary. Both sides suffer in this way. And so I think we've seen an opportunity to carry the conversation forward by opening it up to the community so we can learn best how to support this face of the conflict, which is the loss and the tragedy, while holding space for the future reconciliation and conversations that we look forward to you and Walid leading.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So
Where do we go from here?
Matt is calling on people.
Yeah. Maybe we can hear from Yehuda. Is there anything you'd like to offer at this point, Yehuda, and say?
I wish I had something
and
for this point. It's really you know, as these conflicts continue on, and the situation doesn't seem to change or seem to de-escalate, rather continues to escalate in various ways. I think when we're living in it, I don't know how many people on this call are here in the land right now, but the experience piece that I've been having is one in which it almost starts to feel normal. Like this becomes our reality, right? This is just and I would argue that in a certain way it has been our normal. I think that for the last 100 or so years, there's been a conflict where the volume has gone up and down. I think a lot of things have changed, but the basic, the basic reality has stayed the same. And I would say, but one thing that's clear to me is that the only way for us to be able to move forward at all, specifically Israelis and Palestinians, is for us to both be able to engage with the narrative and identity and experiences of the other without feeling our own threatened. I think that's something that we both have a lot of trouble with for various reasons. And the other thing that I think needs to change is I think we need to reduce the influence of Western governments in the region, especially the United States. And I think a combination of those two things can really lead us somewhere much better.
I would love just one more comment just to add, because having watched the first critical conversation, what gave me the most hope was that the idea of reconsidering the story, so it's the same old story that you say becomes normal, and I've seen it normalized, is that they're both victims and I'm more of a victim. No, I'm more of a victim. And that just kind of spirals into a conflict zone. But what you two were proposing was a new idea where both victims truly have a right to exist as they are. And not so much to highlight the victim of it, but that the story as Israelis see it is different than the story as Palestinians see it. But both voices need to be given a space to be true simultaneously, while then bridging the next cornerstone that allows it to be that way in a more, with the vision of reconciliation from there. So you really spoke about advancing the vision, one where both can maintain the identity as they understand it, but weave it into a fabric of reconciliation.
Right. Well, I'd say part of part of the confusion, maybe, if that's the right, I'm not sure that's the right word, but part of the misunderstanding for sure is that I think Jews and Palestinians define national identity so differently. And therefore, when we see the other doesn't meet our definition of national identity, we tend to reject the other's claim to identity. And I actually have come to the conclusion that that's good news, that that's something that can be positive, because it also, I think the conditions exist, the possibility exists based on the fact that we have such radically different understandings of what national identity means, for us both to achieve our core grievances and being resolved and our aspirations being met without those being in conflict with us. I think we're just after, at least in my experience, I've been doing this work about 15 years on the ground. My experience is that our core aspirations don't really conflict.
That is good news. Yes, thank you, Yehuda. And one of the topics I thought it was important to address that you touched on, which is this hesitancy or unwillingness to communicate with one another. And there's a real fear, first of all, for what others in our various communities will think about that engagement, and even a concern that that level of engagement is dangerous because it provides a platform for views to be expressed that we're uncomfortable with promulgating before, you know, a broader audience. So can you address that, or anyone's welcome to address that?
Yeah, I think the way the table has been set on these conversations here on social media, I think on diaspora campuses, I think wherever these conversations are really taking place, there's this feeling that to be on one side, there's almost this obligation to reject the story and the claims of the other. Like one side is telling the truth and the other side is lying. And I think the reality is much more complicated than that. I think the truth is the way I would define, I don't remember if we did this last time, but if it's helpful, I'll just quickly, you know, offer my definition of narratives, because I think that's helpful in terms of communicating what I'm trying to say. The way I understand a narrative is a collection of facts that are selectively chosen, contextualized within an ideological worldview, and organized to tell a story. And I think there are millions of facts when it comes to the last 104 years of conflict between Jews and Palestinians in this land. And I think that what we both tend to do is center the facts that help us tell the story we want to tell and ignore or reject the facts that complicate that story. So we're telling radically different stories, but for the most part, I think we're both using true facts as the ingredients, as the building blocks for our stories. It's just how we organize those facts to say what we want to say. And I think any real honest seeker of truth will not try to have one, you know, narrative win at the expense of the other, but rather will try to construct a larger narrative that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival narratives. And that just basically means being willing to confront and engage with and accept the facts that don't help us tell the stories we want to tell, that complicate the stories we want to tell, and maybe give legitimacy to the other story. And I think what ultimately happens when we do that is we get somewhere. I understand the fear, and I understand the unwillingness on both sides to do that, because there is, look, there is a lot of pain that a lot of people, like personal pain, that a lot of people have connected to this, obviously. And, you know, and sometimes that pain only makes sense if we believe the demonization of the other, like that pain can only like have its place and have meaning in our lives if you know, if it means what we think it means, what we've made it mean. So there's like a danger, something. Like I remember once I had this conversation with a Jewish woman whose son was murdered during the Second Intifada. He was 12 years old at the time. He was cutting school, and he was killed in a very, very gruesome way. And she, part of how she made sense of the loss of her son was to think of Palestinians a certain way. And when I challenged that, I realized I was playing with something very dangerous in her head, in her psychology. I was doing something that I had no right to do, to be honest, even though I think she's wrong, and I think the political conclusions she reached as a result of her trauma and her tragedy are not productive. I might think all of that, but when I was actually having a conversation with her and trying to shift her perspective, I realized I was touching something in her psychology that I had no right to play with, that needed to be. And I think this is just as true for a Palestinian mother who's suffered similar loss. And I felt terrible about it, to be honest. I saw what I was doing was really, really not healthy for her. And the next day I sought her out to apologize, because I realized that I had no right to do that. So I think we need to be careful, that we need to be aware of that. But ultimately, even though this hesitancy and sometimes I would even call it a principled ignorance of the other, because, we want them to just be the fantasy antagonist in our story instead of being like a real multi-dimensional, right? Like often when both societies talk about the other, we're talking about a very flat antagonist, right? We're not really talking about, we rarely talk about the nuanced psychology of the other. They're just this like static, flat, type of creature. So I think that when we actually find the willingness and the courage to engage with the other's identity and story and experiences in an honest and not just in an honest way, but in a way that's like really trying to understand, like with a genuine desire to really understand, I think we can actually arrive somewhere unexpected, which is, I guess, where I ultimately arrived at, saying, wait a minute, this is not actually a zero-sum game. Like, there is actually a way for us both to win on a very, very deep level. But it requires a lot of work on our part. And unfortunately, I have to be honest, I think very small percentage of Israeli society is ready for that. I suspect, based on my experiences, that a slightly larger percentage of Palestinian society is ready for it. And that might be an interesting conversation in and of itself, why that might be. But it's still a small sliver of each population that's really ready to especially now. I would say we were a lot closer 7 months ago than we are today to being able to have these conversations with each other. Now it's much more difficult, just given the events of the last 7 months.
Absolutely. Well, I was reading yesterday that the average attention span these days is 45 seconds. And we live in a soundbite world where we have 45 seconds at best to make our case. And a lot of times that looks like, all right, how can I get a slam dunk to win the argument and be right and make the other guy wrong? And so that's why we organized this whole series, which is to create a broader space for what is ultimately a very important conversation. It's a life or death conversation for so many people. And we also see the opportunity of it. And I think actually when we take the time to engage honestly with one another, there can be a sense of, if not joy, certainly satisfaction at the end of it, that we've come to understand one another better and taken some progress toward moving from a very really unsustainable and undesirable reality.
Matt, can I just interrupt you there? Because
yes, Bill.
Amy's raising her hand. She wants to speak. And I think also Majid had something he wanted to say earlier on.
Great.
Is that still the same?
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. First of all, I just have to say that the situation makes me, I'm Jewish. I've been to Israel read a lot of history, and it makes me so upset that I almost can't function. So if I cry or you see me, that's why. But I want to pick up on both what Yehuda and Matt said about the conversation. And that's why I feel like these conversations are so critical. And I want to share that an Israeli-American friend of mine sent me some lectures, some videos, and they were by an Israeli who, one was on the Jewish narrative and the other was on the Palestinian narrative. And I felt like that was in the vein of what you both were talking about, what we're talking about. You know, he talked about narrative and showed how our narratives were so different. The other thing I wanted to say is there's a book called Jerusalem 1913, and there's also a PBS film on it that shows 1913 Jerusalem as like the turning point. And it has quotes from Palestinians, from Americans that illuminate to some extent the time in Jerusalem where there was really a multicultural society where people really did live together. The other thing I want to say is I'm going to a community Seder on Sunday, and for some of the key, so the Seder is the Passover prayers at the meal, and for many of them, there's an introduction, and then there's words written by a Palestinian, and then there's a comment. And the one that sticks in my mind is there's karpas, parsley, and what they have is strawberry as a representation of the fields of strawberries that is a major Palestinian crop and what's been happening to those fields. And that as Jews at this time of Passover, when we're committed to, you know, open our doors and let all the hungry come and eat, when we're remembering, whether we think it's literally true or not, I have no opinion on that, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is part of our tradition and that we're remembering our time in Egypt so that we can have empathy with others. And so that's where I'm coming from. And the one other thing that's related to what I said about the history, and I think it was Matt who said, someone said, get the United States out of it. And that's to remember that Britain and the United States are involved in, you know, and World War I are involved in the fracture of our communities. And I was very active in the Vote Uncommitted Michigan. And I see by the subsequent, like, we got somewhere and yet the arms are still being sent to Israel. So anyway, it's very complicated and I find it hard to, my thing is let's stop. Let's just everybody stop, you know, and I see how that's not possible, but sometimes I can't get beyond that. And I think this communication, the conversation is one way to encourage people to see where we're coming from, seeing that and as you have said, the losses are heartfelt everywhere. And it's not only, you know, this, you know, it's Sudan, it's here, it's there, and it seems like we've got something where we can start. And there are some other models that aren't perfect, but South Africa, and there are other places in the world. Well, I think about the United States and Japan being friends. If you read the story of the World War II in the Pacific, OMG. So that kind of gives me a little example of people who have come together after horrendous war. And thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you. And I'm inclined to agree on a personal level that it's all about human beings. The problem can't be solved. What can be solved is what people think of one another, and they can only get there by being allowed to speak their mind, whatever is in it. And if everyone can do that, at least we'll get somewhere. Majid, did you have something you wanted to say?
Let's hear.
I very much was relating to the comments that have been shared so far. Yehuda mentioned conflict becoming normalized. Just very briefly about my own personal background, how I came to this work. I was born in Mosul, Iraq, the biblical city of Nineveh, to an Iraqi Arab Muslim father and an American Christian mother. So unrelated to Israel and Palestine, conflict has been a way of life in Iraq. And through most of my life, there have been wars ongoing, whether it's the Iraq-Iran war, the 1990 war with involving Kuwait, and subsequently the Second Gulf War. So I've had cousins fighting against Americans in those wars. I've have close friends who've lost their sons, American sons, in the war in Iraq. So very much understand kind of the trauma of losing family to conflict, and I kind of feel that accident of birth has called me to this work. I've been chair of the board of the Dialogue Institute in Philadelphia, a nonprofit that teaches dialogue. Yehuda mentioned how we have to be able to share our narratives. Dialogue means together we're learning together, and you can't learn without hearing the other narrative. So that's something we've worked very hard to teach. We bring young people from the Middle East to try to teach them a better way of living together, of dialoguing, of getting to respect the other. Iraq has more diversity than just about any country in the region. They have Kurds, they have Yazidis, they have Christians, Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis. Amy mentioned World War I and the borders. There are 30 million Kurds living between 30 million Kurds living between northern Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and 100 years of trying to negate their identity. I mean, in Turkey they call them Turkish or Mountain Turks. It takes a lot of work to get people to understand that othering, demonizing is not good for anybody. And the sooner people learn to dialogue, learn to have compassion for the harm done to every person, and seek a better way, the better it is for all of our peoples. So I'll stop right there. But that is why I'm engaged in this work. I will mention, even though I am an Iraqi-born American, I've been to Israel twice. I've been fortunate to meet with just about every stakeholder group in Israel and in Palestine, from left-wing Israelis to right-wing Israelis, leaders in the settlements. I've met with many within Palestinian refugee camps, Palestinian leadership, with Palestinians in Gaza. So I've been able to see firsthand the anger, the distrust, the struggle that exists in that land. And one of the reasons I'm involved in this work is because I do hope that my lived experience can be helpful.
Thank you, Majid. Daniel, did you have something you wanted to say?
Sure. Well, I appreciate being part of this conversation. I certainly agree completely that understanding the other is the core of what we need to do. It's very disturbing to see the dehumanization that's taking place on both sides. It's very discouraging. It's very, very sad. There are people that I know that were on the left-leaning side that I hear them say things now in the Jewish community that sort of shock me. But the point that I want to make is I've been involved in interfaith work for a long time, and I will continue to be involved in interfaith work. But I'm extremely disappointed in this moment because when Jewish people got attacked, people disappeared on the other side, and that hurts. The other thing I want to say is what I find really frustrating, and I'm not sure that this is the group to deal with it, is the inability for basic facts. I understand the narrative, I understand perception, I understand history is socially constructed, but there's some basic facts, and they've disappeared. They're gone. You know, Palestine is got two colonial roots. It's got the Roman root and it's got the British root. I'm not arguing against a Palestinian state. I think the best thing that could happen for Israel is a country called Palestine. I've been arguing that for years. But this idea that this colonial decolonization mentality around something that's colonial, it just frustrates me. 60% of Palestine is Jordan. And who are the Jordanians? Well, obviously the kingdom is Hashemites. Who are they? Well, they're from the Arabian Peninsula. I guess they're settler colonialists too. So I'm finding myself really discouraged because basic facts on both sides are being railroaded by propaganda. And at some point, we got to get past the respecting and understanding and listening to each other, to working on some just basic realities of, you know, the idea that Jews aren't indigenous to that region. Why do we have to talk about that? Why is that even being challenged? Go back to Poland, you hear on campuses? So I'm finding the whole thing really discouraging, working in university, that third grade level of understanding of the Levant is being taken over by propaganda, and that doesn't help. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Daniel. Yehuda, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'd like to address a little bit of what Daniel said, because it's a frustration that I've definitely experienced. And I think the way I heard Daniel, and please correct me if I'm wrong, for me, it's half the equation. I think what Daniel really gave expression to is, you know, I said earlier that both of us have trouble really engaging the story of the other in a very real way. And I think what Daniel expressed was how Palestinians and many allies of Palestinians have, you know, either deliberately or not deliberately really misunderstood the Jewish story. And one thing I want to throw out there that I'm not sure people always consider, especially in pro-Israel spaces, is the extent to which our story, the Jewish story, is actually difficult to understand for people who are not us, because it's very unique in that we're the only example I can think of an ancient civilization that was destroyed, yet actually managed to maintain its identity in like a gas form for 2,000 years, and then come back to the country it had been displaced from and take possession of that country, and partially through, you know, colonial methods. So I think that, you know, when we're talking about, you know, these words like indigenous or decolonization, I think we have to be very careful how we use them. Like, for example, I would definitely argue that the Jewish people are indigenous to this land in the same way that a plant is indigenous to a place. But I think that it's also true that the Zionist movement used a lot of, as a verb now, I'm not talking about Jews as a noun, but as a verb, utilized a lot of colonial methodology, which is maybe the methodology of the era, in order to achieve that Jewish liberation. Amy spoke about Passover, the Passover Seder before. For the last 2,000 years, the Passover Seder was the night, was the event built into our calendar to tell the next generation our story. And part of our story internally was driven for 2,000 years by this commitment to return to Palestine, take possession of the land, and rebuild our civilization, what the Romans took from us. I think that's something that we've been driven by for thousands of years. I think it only got confusing for us around the time of the French Revolution. But it's important to appreciate how unique we are in history. And as a result, one could look at the Zionist movement as an indigenous people's liberation movement, but one could also look at the Zionist movement as a colonial project, organized and carried out by people from Europe, because that's also partially true, meaning the Zionist leaders, it's true, they were only in Europe because they were displaced from here, centuries earlier, but it's true that the leaders of the Zionist movement, the movement was created in Europe. So one could look at it using true facts, not using the made-up facts. Using true facts, one could see Zionism either way. So I think that for me, I would very much argue that a lot of the colonial methodology, and I don't think it's over. I think that Israel as a state still employs a lot of this methodology, and I think that a lot of that those structures really go a long way in undermining our very real connection to the land. Like I would argue often, even when I speak about the West Bank, like I brought Walid's not here unfortunately, but when I brought Walid to my mountain to where I live, that mountain is full of our history. It's where the Maccabees had their partisan camp for the first 5 years of the revolt against the Seleucid Greek Empire. It's where our ancestor Yaakov had his dream with the ladder and the angels going up and down the ladder. It's where Yoravam ben Nevat, the king of Israel, the first king of Israel when the kingdom split after Solomon's death, built a golden calf to replace the temple in Jerusalem. Like we're talking about a mountain that's really so rich with our history in the West Bank. But I would say that because from a material perspective, the state of Israel employs so many tactics, so many methods that look like settler colonialism, that it's very hard to see our connection if somebody's looking from the outside. I was in Hebron this morning. I led a tour to Hebron this morning, and one of the things I said was that I want Jews to be able to live in Hebron. I just don't like the way that we do. I just don't like how it's carried out. And I would argue that the Jews in Judea are not the Americans in Afghanistan. The problem is we sometimes behave like we are. I would argue that Israel's military occupation of the West Bank actually undermines the Jewish people's very real connection to Judea. And so I think, I'm somebody I've always been. My politics have evolved a lot over the years, so I imagine they'll continue to evolve. I don't think I've arrived at any destination yet. I continue to try to learn from everybody. But one thing that's been consistent in my story, in my journey, has been not just a rejection of the two-state paradigm, but a commitment to resisting the two-state paradigm. And I think that one of the conclusions I reached in the course of resisting a two-state solution is that we need to actually behave as if we belong here, and that's not behaving like colonists. And I think, again, we need to sometimes separate between noun and verb. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Yehuda. I can see 4 hands raised here: Majid, Larry, Lynette, and Elizabeth. Who wants to go first?
Well, I would briefly like to respond to Dan's comments, if I could.
Mhm.
So Dan, you mentioned about why can't people accept certain facts, and I'll speak for myself on this. I believe Jews are indigenous to Israel and to the region, to the Middle East. Coming from Iraq, I know many Iraqi-born Jews or children of Iraqi-born Jews who trace their ancestry back to Babylonian times, 2,500 years ago. There were significant Jewish communities in Baghdad and Mosul and Basra for centuries that played key roles there. Unfortunately, after the 1940s and 50s, Iraq was not a safe place for Jews. So I fully understand where Jews have, for 2,000 years, 3,000 years, wanted to come back to their roots, to their homeland, if you will, and understand the Jewish desire and need for a safe nation where they are not a minority, where they're not oppressed. But you mentioned the fact that Palestine is an invented term, and that Palestinians are not, as such, indigenous to the region. I would argue that Palestinians see themselves mentioned in the Bible, the Philistines. The term Palestinian certainly may be a Roman term, but the Philistines, the people mentioned in the Bible, those are the people that consider themselves Palestinians. Now, over 2,500 years, 3,000 years, there are Palestinians of Egyptian blood, probably of Arabian blood, of Syrian, of other, Lebanese, who came to live in the area. But I do think that Palestinians as a people see themselves indigenous to the land and to the region. And I don't think it's helpful to, I hear it often, that they're not indigenous to the land. Therefore, they're not deserving of the rights of indigenous people. And I would urge you to think about that as a belief, not as a fact, because others might argue that differently. And if you actually do, I've done my 23andMe DNA analysis, and if you read up on research on DNA, you'll find that my most ancient ancestor, who lived more than 5,000 years ago, is a male who lived in Mesopotamia. And roughly 25% of male Jews in Israel trace back to that same male individual. We share the same chromosome. And roughly 25% of Palestinians trace back to that same individual as well. So to argue who's indigenous, who isn't indigenous, I don't think that's a helpful debate.
If I may, I completely agree with you. Both Jews and Arabs have legitimate claims to the land. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Larry, you were next. Would you like to say something now?
Yes, I would. A few things quickly. First of all, I thank each and every one of you for being here and participating. It's a hopeful sign. Next, I'd like to refer to something that Reverend Rodney taught some of us who are on this call about two sides. I don't remember who said, I think it was Daniel, who said he was disappointed in people from the other side. Daniel, I suggest that they were from your side, the side of people who want peace. And the other side is the people who don't want peace and are not willing to work for it. So instead of thinking us and them as being Israelis and Palestinians or Jews and Palestinians, let's think about those who want peace and those who don't. Just a suggestion. Question for all of you guys who are talking about facts and narratives and whatever. Some of you may be right, some of you may be wrong. I may be right sometimes in in facts or narratives that I present. But right now, we're preaching to the choir. Each and every one of us is interested in seeing things get better. Is this kind of a dialogue what's going to make Moshe and Muhammad not throw rocks at each other? If you guys have any suggestions on that point, I'd love to hear it. Complete.
Thank you, Larry. I've got you next, Lynette. Do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
And I'm acknowledging your hand as well, Samir.
Yes, thank you,
Please
thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yeah, so I wasn't here during the last event. I'll raise my hand so I can be back there. And so I missed out on what the conversation was. And I find it really very interesting that there's a lot of agreement about not othering people. And in this room, in the conversation, we continue to talk about the other side and the other narrative and the other story, while we completely internalize othering people. We declare the problem as othering people. And I have a particular experience as a human being. And when I come to this platform, I come to this platform as a human being. And the discussion and what my experience is that my family comes from a 5,000-year-old Canaanite village, a city of Benjamin, a place that Jesus walked, a place that Salahuddin honored as a Christian village. I come from a human experience that's not spoken about very often, and it doesn't fit on either side. And I don't see any of you fitting on either side of this story. And as far as what you call a place, all names are invented. All language is invented. And if I want to say, because of my experience, that Christians, by the very fact that they practice Christianity, are indigenous to the land, then 1 billion people on the planet are, and it gives them the right to take the land by force. That's just some declaration I can make up. And a person that's indigenous to Hawaii or China that practices that religion, and the British can claim that they're not colonizers. The French did that in Algeria. They said, we have Phoenician blood. That's what they did in Lebanon. We're going back. I can go back to Africa. All of us can. Then to argue the people that are there are not indigenous, that would be interesting. And the term Palestinian or Israeli or whatnot, from carbon dating, we have Canaanite semi-nomadic settlements, artifacts from 9,500 years ago, before recorded language of what a name of that place would be. It's not in dispute that the Canaanites are the first people to settle the area. It's not in dispute that the first time that the different city-states and tribes of the area become under one administrative block under the Romans, whether you like or not the Romans. The word came into use, Palestine. And if you trace it back to the Greeks, because it was used before with the Greeks, there is a debate about the etymology, but it could be coming, what many people assert is that it comes from the same root as paleo, which means ancient, and it means ancient land. And it means to be Palestinian people of an ancient land. So that Greeks would be calling Palestinian people of the ancient land, inclusive of the Israelite tribes, of the Hittite tribes, of all of the tribes that blended into the area. And it's also not in dispute that those people existed before Islam existed. Who were those people? They were Christians. They were Jewish Palestinians. They were worshiping what we call pagan religions. It was not in dispute that there were Jewish Palestinians for 2,000 years. And neither does any Palestinian that I've ever heard of dispute this. So nobody is really disputing that there are Jewish people that are indigenous to this land. Just the same as there really isn't any dispute that are Christian people indigenous to the land. But if a Chinese or a British person comes to the land and says that I'm indigenous here because I'm Christian, it sounds pretty ridiculous to somebody like me with my personal experience. And I would feel pretty ridiculous going to Africa and forcing an African person out of their home, or just saying I have a right to live here just because. According to history, all of humans come from here. And that even might be true. I see a really big punishment of a lot of people throughout history that have stood for in having one country. I think that people really forget about their own terminology. We can interpret artifacts, but we also have documentation where there were funds called the Jewish Colonial Fund. There were multiple organizations that called themselves colonialists, declared it in their speaking, declared partition, declared a state that qualifies people by religion. And how many of you would accept it to be here in America and say that the function of the state is to qualify me as a Jew and designate what my rights are and aren't? How dare they to do such a thing? Would I accept that for my neighbor? I find many people would not, and yet the same people would argue that in another place of the world, this should exist. And this is somehow in alignment with what the Declaration of Human Rights is. And I disagree with that. Its own declaration of the State of Israel is not in alignment of what human rights were declared. So for 2,000 years, we had a country under various administrations. It might have included part of Jordan or not, or Egypt or Turkey. And if you actually go on the ground and you ask the people, who are they? They'll tell you, I'm from this village. I'm the son of this person. I'm the daughter of this, bint that, ibn that person. They will tell you, Ana Urdani, I'm Jordanian. regardless of whatever administration was ruling over them, whatever foreign government came in and told us who we are. We say, "Ana Palestinian." Yeah. We say, we are Palestinian. We say, we are Misri, Egyptian. We say what we are. And I see that there's this kind of parallel dialogue happening of the administrative bloc, whoever it is that comes in, somehow defines the local population. Under the Islamic rule, the majority of people in Jerusalem were Christian. And if you look on the newspapers in Britain, at the time, I have like a picture of it. It says, "We saved Jerusalem from the Muslims." And today, Christianity is less than 1% of the population there. Under Islamic rule, it was 20% of the whole country and 50% of the capital.
And can I stop you there and just go to some of the others?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very interesting line of argument, and I think we need to continue that. But can we let some of the others have a say, and then
Yes,
maybe
of
come
course.
up with it? Thank you. Elizabeth, you were going to go next, I think.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I think that when my professional background is having spent 20 years as a peace and conflict specialist, working both on the NGO side and then for many years on the UN side. I worked for DPKO, which, as you might know, is the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and maybe 20 conflict zones from Afghanistan to Syria to Kosovo, Tajikistan, etc. I think what everyone has shared is a very, very valid perspective. And as Larry, I believe, also said, we are an echo chamber because we're speaking to people who do feel that we need to expand, that we feel the impetus to move forward in peace. And all of what was shared, whether it's the looking at the other and fully listening to the idea of peace building movements, they're all valid. The question I hear the call to action is, how do we move this beyond the echo chamber to a greater political solution? And while I would say that the UN has terrific failures. I mean, I've written on why peace agreements that were brokered under the UN were not successful. But I do think that looking at some of the other global models of where there were successes is important. I think when you look at the, many of the points that we've seen where conflicts either were suppressed or because they weren't resolved, they were suppressed, was when we created balkanization, and I spent 5 years in that area working for the UN. When we created separate city-states, a separate balkanization, we gave the Bosnians their own state because they had been, 250,000 Bosnians had been slaughtered. So we gave them their own city-state. It wasn't a viable state. We created balkanization, or we created a cessation of the war. We didn't create meaningful peace in almost any of the conflicts I've been involved in. And I think that's an important, when we look at political solutions, which ones actually have had inclusivity and have been sustained. I would argue that, thank you for that comment, Yehuda. Yeah, but I just think about that we're not really an echo chamber, but I just feel the call to expand this conversation to a political solution, right? That's really what I meant to say. And when we look at the few places where we didn't actually just force out the others and create an independent state, which was, in my opinion, that's the majority of the times we've done, we as the international community have done that. But we look at the few places where it's been somewhat sustained peace and inclusivity. I would argue that Northern Ireland is one of the few places where there went from being raging conflict to a redeeming situation and a fairly inclusive political solution. I think that one has to look at there's three prongs, in my opinion. The policy prong, which is brokered on the international level through the bilateral agreements, through the diplomatic solutions, through the UN or other, diplomatic pressurized diplomacy bodies that can then assist the two political factions, or the multitude of political factions, because as Lynette pointed out, there's certainly more than two, although we tend to bifurcate this. So firstly, on the policy level, there's got to be a political solution. There also has to be, as the majority of the conversations that we've had today seem to be talking about, the community level engagements and looking at the other as a part of ourselves, and the community level engagements. And I would say the assistance of the NGO community in moving the conversation forward and doing real, engagement of the type that we're talking about. And the third level, of course, is the one that we are speaking really intensely about, is the individual level, our own individual responsibility to our neighbors and our friends and those who we don't know yet as friends, but our own individual actions. But without that political solution, without the political interventions, and there has to be political will to have those interventions, the political and diplomatic, I've never seen a conflict move beyond the conflict state to a resolution. And again, I'm not defending the UN. I'm not with them for a reason anymore. They have their flaws, indeed, but some kind of mechanism that's going to bring the parties, the multitude of parties, to the table, because it has to be a top-level solution in concert with the grassroots levels, the interventions. And there's lots more I could say about that, but I just wanted to bring those points forward. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yehuda, would you like to say something before you go? I know that you need to rush off.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate a lot of what's been said so far. I do get the sense, and I kind of hate to open this up and then run. I feel like I'm just like throwing a grenade into the room and then running away. But I think that this is not an echo chamber. I think that there have been views expressed that I don't think should be ignored or glossed over, that are at least ostensibly on the surface like in contradiction to one another. And there's been, and I think that's okay. I think it's important, like somebody mentioned before, that there needs to be a feeling. I think it was you, Bill, who mentioned that people should feel safe expressing whatever's on their mind truly. And I think that when someone does that, maybe we have an impulse to either especially in a forum like this where we're friendly and maybe to a certain extent looking to pretend we're all on the same page 100%. But I get the sense that there's an impulse to either kind of ignore the problematic part, or the part that other people might disagree with, because we think that the alternative would be to attack, would be to go and tell the person why they're wrong, etc. And I think there's a third way here. I think there's a way to engage with things, engage with disagreements in a way that helps us go deeper and really understand the misunderstandings. So I think there's so much misunderstanding. Even this morning when I led this tour in Hebron, a journalist tagged along, an Israeli journalist tagged along, and she said she was writing a story about Jewish holy sites being in contentious areas. Okay, and I said to her, I have a problem with your context. I have a problem with how you're contextualizing this whole thing. The Cave of the Patriarchs is not a holy place for the Jews. Okay, I mean, it might also be a holy place for the Jews, but in the story the Jews have been telling ourselves for thousands of years, and I don't really care if people accept that it's true or not true. I'm more interested in everybody on at least entertaining the idea that this is a story the Jewish people have been telling ourselves for thousands of years. In that story, Hebron, the cave of the patriarchs, is where our ancestors are buried. It's the burial grounds of our most cherished ancestors, right? Like when we talk about Jewish identity, really, we're talking about the biological and ideological descendants of a very unique set of ancestors, 12 tribal identities, okay? And the people who've joined us over the years. Has always been a way for outsiders to become insiders, etc. And in my experience, I don't want to speak for Palestinians, but in my experience, when Palestinians speak about Palestinian identity, what they mean is the indigenous peoples of Palestine throughout time, including many of my ancestors, including many of the characters in the Tanakh, in the Bible, including some of the people buried in Hebron that we consider to be our ancestors. Right? So I actually find it to be helpful when we really open up these kind of points of contention and these different perspectives, because when we ignore them, like I happen to be of the belief that it's actually going to be the quote unquote extremists and moderates who can lead us to peace. Those who are really living their respective national story to the point that they're willing to be violent for what they believe to be important to their people, whatever that might be. I think those are the, whether it's the Hamas fighter, whether it's the Hilltop Youth, whether I believe that these are the identities on both sides that are so deeply living their collective story, that they're functioning outside of what we can call like the liberal Western ideological paradigm. Like they're functioning, that there are things that are important to them that are not just sending their kids to a university to make money and drinking Coca-Cola and watching NBA basketball. Like they're functioning outside of that, whether we're talking about what the West would call a radical Muslim, whether we're talking about a Marxist, whether we're talking about a Jew like me, like we're functioning outside of this, of the boundaries of what Western liberalism defines as a good person, as a normal person, as a safe person. And here, I don't want to speak for the entire region, but I definitely want to speak for for the Palestinians and Jews in this land. I found over the last decade and a half that it's specifically the quote unquote extremists that have a much easier time reaching new paradigms, like actually finding ways where we can change the role that the other plays in our story. That the other doesn't have to be the antagonist in my story. I'll just give you an example. In the community I live in, most of the people probably vote for what would be considered in the media like the Israeli far right. Okay, I actually don't think terms like right wing and left wing are very helpful to Israeli or Palestinian society. I think they're, also liberal, conservative, religious, secular. I think these are very Western framings for understanding like socio-political communities and categories. I don't think they're really that accurate when talking about Israeli society or Palestinian society. But I would say that to the average Jew living in the West Bank, or voting for somebody like Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir, right? The story they're living is actually one in which the Palestinians are peripheral. Right? I would say that Jewish communities in the West Bank are not homogenous; they're quite different, but there is a common denominator ideologically, and I think that common denominator is that we are an ancient people from this land that was displaced unjustly by the Romans. We somehow managed to maintain our identity and ultimately come back, and now the superpowers, the West, wants to displace us again through a two-state solution. And the only method of resistance we figured out so far is to create as many Jewish communities as we can on as many mountains as we can to make moving us logistically impossible. Now, I think if such Jews could be convinced that a more effective way of resisting the two-state solution would be to actually engage with Palestinians, try to understand their story without feeling threatened, and finding some common ground and common struggle, perhaps, in pursuit of a one-state reality where we both get what we want. Meaning, if we're defining Jews as the descendants of those people buried in Hebron, and we're defining Palestinians as the indigenous peoples of Palestine throughout time, including the Jebusites, including the Canaanites, including the Philistines, including my ancestors, including Crusaders who just stuck around and absorbed into the local population. Like, if we're accepting those definitions, then in theory we could achieve an equal democratic one-state reality that's fully expressing both Jewish and Palestinian identity simultaneously in a very deep way, in its policies, in its institutions, in its character. But it's only possible if we change the role that we each play in each other's story. And I think that it does begin with being honest about the disagreements, or the misconceptions, and the misunderstandings. Like before, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but something that I think Majid mentioned before in response to Daniel was that he accepts that there are Jews that are from this region, right, from the Levant. I know I might have misunderstood Majid. I want to start with a disclaimer that I 100% accept I could have misunderstood what was said, and I'm happy to be corrected. But the inference there I got, and I got this also from Lynette a little bit on some of the things that she had said, is that the Jews who came back here from Europe, the Ashkenazi Jews, are not from the region, don't belong, right? Like, there was some talk about us having like a religion that tells us we have a right to a place. The Jew, what we call the Jews today, the people of Israel, actually predate the social constructs of religion and race and ethnicity and national identity, and we predate those social constructs. I think the closest thing to what we are would be like a civilization, like the Mayans. Like, we have a territorial component to our identity, we have a national component to our identity, we have a spiritual component, a legal component, but we're more than the sum of those parts. And we've been telling ourselves for thousands of years that we are going to come back to this land that we were displaced from. That has nothing to do with religion. That's the story we've been telling ourselves. And I appreciate that, Majid. And also I'll say that the Zionist movement, I think, is guilty of a lot of not only colonialist language, but also colonialist methodology. But at the same time, I also understand that those Zionist leaders were accepting as fact, it was a given to them, that we might be engaging in not only colonial policies, but also colonial rhetoric, but we're doing so in pursuit of a goal that stretches back thousands of years to return to the land we believe we're from, right? That we actually believe that we were displaced from and have not stopped yearning to go back to. The same way a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon or Jordan or Detroit might yearn to come back to this land, right? This is something that was intergenerational. That the whole point, I would say, of the Passover Seder for many, many centuries was to remind ourselves, that's why we say next year in Jerusalem, right? To remind ourselves that we're not home, we're going back to our land, right? And so I think that when, that even though the Zionist movement came from Jews coming from Europe and used a lot of colonial language and colonial methodology, we are not like Jews are not like Christians and Muslims and Hindus. Like, to be a Jew is not a religious identity, right? It's an identity of shared ancestry, shared purpose, and a shared vision for the world, in my opinion, that really does need to to be understood before we can talk about, but so we don't run the risk of just kind of dealing with our identity on a very surface level based on somebody's political interests or the outcome they would like to see.
Very good.
Thank you,
Very
Yehuda.
good.
Esam, do you still want to say?
Hi, yes. Th Thank you, Bill, for calling me. And thank you, Matt, for the kind invitation. And I'm very grateful to be part of this discussion today. As Matt mentioned earlier, I'm Egyptian, and actually I left Egypt a few years ago after being involved in the youth movement and the Egyptian revolution, and then I was forced to leave Egypt because of that. And my whole background has been working to bring different people together despite all the differences. And within the conflict, that the Palestinian issue, it's been a huge part of the whole region, and it's very difficult to differentiate or to make the separation or make this a separate case, because the influence of that particular conflict has been spread and has been used over decades to benefit most of the wrong people, in which I mean through my brief experience have been that was been used as an excuse not to achieve any democratization process in the region, and has been an excuse for oppression. That was the case in Egypt. That was the case in Iraq for a long for a long time. And then even nowadays in Egypt has been used an example to justify why certain governments will be allowed to oppress their people. So there's a very direct benefit to be involved and engaged in that dialogue, beyond even the immediate benefit of solving that issue and finding a common ground to solve that problem. I'm saying this because I want to make the point of that this issue has gone above and beyond just two people talking to each other, and there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and active effort from so many people who are trying on purpose to spread a lot to stop actually people from understanding the reality of the situation. So discussion like this is, I think, in my opinion, one of the most important things we could do, just to listen to what the reality of the situation and how people actually feel and see that situation. And once we move past those misunderstandings, I think will be the first steps on just helping this whole region to move forward. And I truly believe the whole region needs that conflict to be solved. And I do want to repeat again what I had in mind, because my friends here have been covering this issue. I'm sorry, covering those points over and over again. So, but again, I think the one thing I want to again highlight or talk about, despite the identity discussion or conversation or question, we do need to understand, to move forward on that, I think we need to focus more on what's happening these days, not going 2000, despite how important understanding history and politics is. But as long as we are brave enough to focus on what's happening these days and how people feel, how the people who are directly influenced by it or affected by it or suffering as a result of it, we're not gonna move that much forward. We will keep going into circles of not very useful historical dialogue over what this construct means, and can we agree on that construct or not, or how can we objectively understand the historical facts. That's not going to take us anywhere. But if we really can talk about what's really happening today and how can we fix it or stop it or deal with it or change it, we're not going anywhere. And a platform like this is going to be one of the most important things, because we're coming here today with the intention of being, we want to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem. And this is the very minimum thing to do and to move forward. So when I have family in Gaza, and I have family in Palestine. My family origins are from Palestine, and they moved to Egypt at some point. So I do have direct families, and I have direct cousins in Palestine. And when I hear from them, I do understand things I couldn't imagine understanding before. And I also lucky enough to have many Jewish friends and friends who are Israeli friends, and I also hear from them. And when I take a moment to slow down and just see that from their perspective and free myself, liberate myself from all of the historical context and the political context of things, I see the picture in a different way, and makes me more focused on, okay, now I understand what's happening today. How can I move forward? How can I change that? And the solution comes kind of clear and easy to approach, but also the difficulties of that solution come clearer, and feel like there could be some parties of the equation they're really not sincere about finding a solution for the situation, and keep listening to those parties. That will be the problem. Maybe a right-wing government in Israel, maybe dictators in the region who feed or like maintain their authority or regime over the continuous of that conflict. Maybe lobbying firms in the West that they're happy of taking more money, or maybe the military complex industry who are benefiting from continuous wars. Those people sadly are very influential in the equation, and sadly they are increasing the timeline of any conflict, not only that one, but bringing just day-to-day normal people like that, this group coming together, talking about what is actually happening today and how can we move forward. I think that's the best thing we could ever do. And I had so many other things I wanted really to cover, but I think everyone here really who spoke before me covered things more beautifully and more elegantly than I could ever possibly do. So I will stop here, and I will just conclude my comment with one thing. That I truly believe the importance of what we're doing here, but as long as we can focus on what's happening today, and find a way out of it to change it, our mission will be very hard, and it will take much longer than we all hope for. Thank you.
Thank you. Samir, you wanted to say something, yeah?
Okay, yes, I'm very inspired by everyone, and thank you for giving me some more time. I'll make it brief, but I think it's important at this point to return to circle back to Walid and Yehuda, which are the cornerstone of what is bringing us here in the conversation, that I think is paramount to promote, because they are on the ground today. They are both from, conflicting areas today, and they are both willing to talk to each other and pave the new ideas that it makes space for everyone's narrative to move forward today. And I think, I hold them like little sparks, and you only need a little spark to get a fire going. And if they're on the ground and they're willing to give each other the time and give us all the platform to help understand the issue today, and while making space for all of their narratives, there are a plethora of narratives. And I think the sooner we can just accept that they all can be argued and defended and just move past that, where to Larry's point, peace, are you trying to build peace or not, right? Clearly we all want to be building peace, and then there are ideas there that will include everybody equally in light of your narrative, in light of your history, which, you know, and so if the premise is to accept all of those stories, much like water in an ocean, we're all coming from everywhere. And we can argue where we came from and where we belong and all of this, but we're splashing up against each other. That's just how it is. So everybody has this place, and these two are, you know, on the front, you know, on the ground, you know, again, just, you know, for the peace and humanity elements of what we would need to instill and agree upon moving forward, I think is where I'd like, I feel we can go from here. And I just want to thank everyone again for showing up, and Matt, and for putting Walid and Yehuda together to be able to be the forward leaning, you know, elements to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Samir.
Look, we're out of time according to the plan. However, we still got some people needing to speak. We've got Artie, Orlando, and Hank.
We can keep going. Maybe we can go until 2 and let them speak, and then we'll say a few closing remarks and call it a wrap.
I think so. Yeah, if that's all right with all of you. Yeah.
Yeah, and anyone who needs to drop, of course, can.
Okay, then Artie, would you like to go
yes.
first? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I want to do in velocity, speak with velocity. What is your name? Laneta? Is I'm speaking it right? Got it right. Yes.
Lynette.
Right. And others. I want to say something that the young fellow just left was talking about his about the Jewish nation. I just want to say, I got the fact, this war, we need to deal with this. We need to find some solution to stop the war. Say, for example, if the war stopped tomorrow, or maybe next week, it's over with. This program here today is about bringing peace to the Middle East. That's before the war broke out. So therefore, if the war stopped today, the problem I noticed down through the years seems like it's about land. This is my land. No, this is my land. So after the war is over, whose land is it? And as I was reading this document here in the biblical text, 4,000 years ago, this woman named, her name is Sarah, and Hagar was in the same house. Ishmael was born about 13 years of age, Isaac, a little bitty boy, and they had a disagreement that Isaac and Ishmael was mocking Isaac, picking at him. And all of a sudden, Sarah got angry. Listen, Abraham, get this kid out of the house. And this bondwoman, this slave woman, get him out of this house. And all of a sudden, Abraham, he was upset. Not my son Ishmael, he will not believe. And then God spoke and said, listen to your wife, man. Listen to your wife. And all of a sudden, God said, let the child and the bondwoman leave. For he is not the inheritance of Isaac. He is not the inheritance of Isaac. And when Isaac had a boy named Jacob, that was the descendant. And so the Lord God said he's not the descendant of Isaac. So the land really belonged to Israel. And even after the war is over, still will be a conflict. There will still be of the story. Somebody lying. Somebody said the land is mine. Somebody said the land is mine. Somebody's telling a lie. And in my study, after Jesus, 1,000 years later, when what his name, Muhammad came along, he had a story. And his story, Ishmael is the promised child. Wait a minute, 1,000 of years later versus a story that's been out there for 4,000 years. Somebody is lying. And we need to get to the root of the problem. It's not religion. It's not religion. It's not religion. It's not the Jewish religion, not no Islamic religion. Somebody was promised that land. And when Israel came in the land and took over the land, because of their disobedience and rebellion against the Lord God of Israel, all of a sudden God drove Israel out of the land. Then the Palestinians, the Philistines began to move in, but nothing could grow, nothing could happen. All of a sudden, God began to bring the children of Israel back into the land, and that's when the land began to prosper. Water, grass. Why wasn't it growing when the Palestinians was there? Because the Lord God said the land is Israel's land. And if everyone deny that, then you're denying 4,000 years of history. Not religion, got nothing to do with religion. It got something to do with the people that the Lord said, you are the descendants of Isaac, Jacob, and the land is your land, period. I'm complete.
Thank you, Artie. We have Orlando and then Hank. Orlando, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hmm.
How you doing? Let me just lower my hand here. All right, so whatever. Well, first off, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me to this opportunity to hear things. I'm actually Catholic, but I am, I'm definitely, how can I say this? I'm blessed that I'm a grandfather and I have a 2-year-old grandson. And yeah, thank you. And, it's really important for me. And I'm very fortunate. Like my daughter is fine with allowing me to be instrumental in his upbringing, right? So there's people that have grandkids and their relationships with their children and grandchildren aren't there. So I'm very blessed. And what I'd like is just like, how do we de-escalate? And it's not just obviously October 7th and Israel, but it's the Ukraine and it's Taiwan, North Korea, China. It's just like ridiculous. The level of escalation and how it's become normalized, right? And excuse me. And so I'm grateful for this community that's trying to work it out. I don't know, something in my throat, and figure it out and really arrive at some sort of solution, because we just cannot, this whole thing of just like make more weapons, bombs, and and the fact that people are financially benefiting, it's so lucrative. It's become so lucrative, and we're so numb, and it just never used to be that way. So I'm just grateful that people are trying to get together, get other points of view, work it out in an attempt to de-escalate, and hopefully become do something for our children and their children's children, so they don't have to go through this. It's heartbreaking. And with that, I'm complete. Thank you.
Thank you. So Hank, finally to you.
Well, thank you. This is the first time I'm with this group. So let me just say a couple words about myself. I'm an Israeli Jew. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm here through Larry. We've known each other since we were kids. So maybe it's not surprising that I'm going to jump off from what Larry said. I think we are here preaching to the convinced, preaching to the choir, which is not to say this isn't important. I certainly agree with what Elizabeth said, that the solution has to be much bigger, to be political. I don't see a forum like this necessarily as a vehicle to advance that kind of a solution. What it perhaps has meaning for me is going back to what was said about different narratives and the need to create, somebody talked about a third narrative. I don't know if it's a third or fourth or fifth, but it's an inclusive narrative, which is kind of, I would disagree a bit with the way Larry said it. Isn't those who are for peace and against peace because everybody says they're for peace. I think it's those who are looking towards an inclusive worldview, inclusive way of living, as opposed to a divisive one where the stronger, who is stronger than the other. So I learned an awful lot. I mean, there are a lot of interesting perspectives here. This whole thing of indigenous, non-indigenous, not something that's ever concerned me. It raised some interesting ideas. I don't need the Palestinians or anybody else to tell me that I'm a Jew and that I belong here, just as the Palestinians don't need me to affirm that, or anybody else. And I think that's a reality that we have to deal with. And so I just go to the place that a forum like this, I would like it to give me is help in my own understanding of a more inclusive narrative. I understand the need for it. I accept the different narratives, but I think I, like many other people, need some help in how to create that inclusive narrative. And I think from there, when we can do it for ourselves, we can impact those around us. I think there's importance to that. It's not instead of the political solution where I'm as frustrated as anybody else. I'm as frustrated by the lack of facts or relationship to facts, right? Don't bother me with the facts. I have my opinions and my conclusions. And that's certainly a big part of the problem that stops us from getting to narratives where we understand each other. So I just conclude with saying that I think a forum like this has importance, not for bringing the big solution, which is that we need, but for our own understanding and our own growth, and certainly for me, for my own ability to articulate this inclusive narrative that I believe in and I find often difficult to in fact articulate, and in this way to share it with others. So thank you all.
Thank you, Hank. So shall we wind it up there, Matthew?
Yeah, I'll say a few remarks. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Hank. Welcome to the conversation. To all the people who are with us today for the first time, an extra special welcome for joining us today. And I've seen your email addresses and so forth in the chat, so we'll make sure to get you added to our list so you know about upcoming events. And there's a lot of history, millions of facts, as Yehuda says. We've got our opinions and our stories, and in sum total, we could just say very simply, the past is the past, and there's nothing we can do to change it. And as human beings, we like to be right. We like to be justified, and not only that, we're pretty sure that we're right, and that sometimes the other side is wrong. But at the end of the day, I think the question is still, what are we going to do today? How are we going to go forth from this moment and make a change and really create a world that works for everybody? And Hank, to your point about where do we go from here, and this forum and the value of a forum like this, I invite you to check out our website, and for everyone to check out our website, MEPCF.org. That stands for Middle East Peace Civic Forum. And our theory of change is there, and it includes conversations like this, and it also includes engaging with influencers and artists and visionaries who can take the power of this conversation and the lessons that are learned today to a much wider audience. And I agree that engaging the political community is important. Our premise here is that we have to spark a transformation at the grassroots level and create a popular movement for peace. And once that happens, then the political voices will see that and have some credibility in taking risks for peace. An old friend of mine in politics explained that politicians, they don't like to go too far out on a limb. They like to reflect the will of the people. And of course, a courageous leader who's willing to go out on a limb is a rare commodity, and it does happen. But it certainly is helpful, especially in a conflict like this, to have that grassroots support and a community of like-minded people like we're creating here today that can come together. And honestly, I think it is a somewhat rare thing that people with such diverse views as are present here in this room can come and express those views and be heard and listen to each other and give space to hear things that we may not agree with, but also that open our minds on certain level and that allow us to see things from a broader perspective. And as Yehuda says, to hear things from multiple truths and acknowledge that there isn't just one truth. There are facts, but we also have our perspectives and opinions. So I got into peacemaking because I saw that there was this huge disconnect between the beauty that I saw in my tradition and the reality on the ground. And I think at the end of the day, we just have to start listening to each other and working for that brighter future. And there's a sense of joy and satisfaction, I think, in actually reaching common ground and getting to know each other better. And we can blow off steam either through violence or through dialogue. And sometimes the anger and frustration is going to come out in communication, but it's a heck of a lot better to come out in a conversation where things can be worked through than it is on the battlefield. So that's why we're here today. We're certainly under no illusions that it's going to happen in a single conversation. We're creating a whole series of conversations, and hopefully this will have a ripple effect. There's many great organizations out there that are hosting dialogues. It's become more difficult these days, but we believe at the Middle East Peace Civic Forum that there are really difficult issues that need to be put on the table, and we need to understand how people think differently from the way that we do. So that's the premise. It's a two-way street, and we get to listen to each other. We also get to advocate, sometimes forcefully, for what we believe and for how we see things, and those are both great. So thank you all for coming today. To those who are watching the recorded version, thank you for checking out our recording and for checking out the Middle East Peace Civic Forum and this conversation. Again, please check out our website, MEPCF.org. You can go and sign up for our mailing list there. We request that you support us financially and share with people in the broader community that are interested in this conversation and who may want to join us as partners even. So with that, I thank you. Artie, you have something you want to say?
Yeah, with velocity, I know they're saying that this platform may not be the answer, but what I love about this platform, we invited so many people to come on, and what happened, it could be a person, and I believe in miracles. It could be a person that come on that has connection with Hamas, has a connection with the Prime Minister of Israel, and can share what we're talking about. And all of a sudden, the next day, the war's over with, and because of this platform. So the platform is, I love this platform. It can reach people that maybe another platform cannot. I'm complete.
Okay, Artie, thank you for that. And thank you to our facilitator, Bill Phillips, today. Wonderful job. And to Yehuda and Walid, who had to go, or Walid couldn't be here today, but we again express our condolences for the loss that his friend experienced. And really, there's just been so much loss and devastation all around. So Samir, who's been such a great partner, I don't want to leave anyone out, so I won't name all the names, but Esam joining us for the first time today, a dear old friend. Thank you. So with that, oh, go ahead, Esam. You had your hand raised?
No, I'm sorry. I was just making like a clapping emoji, but it came out as
Got
a
it.
raise.
Sure.
Sorry.
Okay, good. Well, again, thank you all for participating and for sharing so thoughtfully. And we will see you next time at our next event. And hopefully we will be announcing a rescheduled date for Yehuda and Walid's next conversation very soon. All right. Thank you all.
Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Bye, everyone.
You're
Bye.
welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Thank you,
All
guys.
appreciate you.